We're talking about one of the most iconic landmarks in all of Britain, a place where tourists flock every single day to snap their Instagram photos and marvel at the crown jewels. But here's what they don't tell you in the brochures. The Tower of London has witnessed some of the most brutal, gruesome, and downright horrifying execution methods in human history. I'm talking about severed heads, botched beheadings that required 11 blows, and executioners who quite literally chased their victims around the scaffold with an axe. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to see the tower in a completely different light. So let's dive into the dark, twisted world of the Tower of London's most gruesome execution methods, because this is history at its most savage. First, we need to talk about the executioners themselves, because these weren't just random guys with an axe. This was a profession, passed down from father to son, and it came with its own twisted set of rules and rituals. The most infamous of them all was Richard Brandon, who became the king's executioner in the mid-17th century. This guy inherited the job from his father Gregory, and let me tell you, he made a name for himself in the worst possible way. Brandon was the masked man who executed King Charles I in 1649, and according to historical records, this act haunted him until his dying day. On his deathbed, Brandon allegedly confessed that the ghost of the king haunted his dreams, and for good reason. He was paid an unprecedented fee of £30 for that execution, which would be worth about £4,000 today. Plus, he got to keep the king's cloak as a perk of the job. Yeah, you heard that right. Executioners got to keep their victims' clothing and personal items, which led to this absolutely macabre custom where condemned nobles would literally wear their poorest clothes to their execution, because they didn't want to enrich the man who was about to take their life. But the payment structure for these executioners was actually pretty standardized by the 1500s. Records from 1538 show they earned about £3 per year, which sounds like nothing but was equivalent to around £15,000 today. And then they got additional fees for each execution: 13 shillings and 4 pence for a beheading, 6 shillings and 8 pence for a hanging. And despite the money, these guys were absolutely shunned by society. They lived in isolated quarters within the tower complex, completely separated from prisoners and guards alike. Take John Ketch, for example, who became so notorious in the late 1600s that his name literally became slang for executioners. This guy would frequent the Lamb and Flag Tavern, but he always drank alone because other patrons would literally get up and leave when he walked in. Samuel Pepys even wrote about him in his 1684 diary, noting how proud Ketch was of his reputation that he had his name set up in gold letters over his door. But here's where it gets really dark. These executioners developed all these bizarre rituals to cope with what they were doing. Some would ask forgiveness from their victims before delivering the fatal blow. Others would drink heavily the night before an execution. And get this, Catherine Howard's executioner actually practiced his technique on sheep carcasses to make sure he got it right. Now let's talk about the actual methods, because beheading wasn't as simple as one clean chop like you see in the movies. Oh no, this required immense skill, strength, and precision. The executioner's axe weighed 7 pounds and had a blade nearly 18 inches long. You had to swing it with enough force to sever the neck in one blow. And if you messed up, things got really, really bad. But there was actually a more honorable method reserved for the highest-ranking nobles and royalty: execution by sword. This demanded even greater expertise, and it's exactly what Anne Boleyn got when she was executed in 1536. Henry VIII paid Jean Rambaud, a master swordsman from Calais, the equivalent of £23,000 in today's money to do the job. Rombo was famous throughout Europe for his swift and precise technique, and he had this signature move where he would distract the condemned person by asking them to look elsewhere, then strike while their attention was diverted. According to eyewitness accounts, Anne's execution was so swift that her lips were still moving in prayer after the blade had already fallen. Her last words were, "Thus I take my leave of the world." And before she could even finish the sentence, it was over. But not all executioners were as skilled as Rombo. And that's where things get absolutely nightmarish. Let me tell you about Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, whose execution in 1541 was hands down the most brutal in the Tower's entire history. This 67-year-old woman refused to lay her head on the block, and what happened next is almost too horrifying to describe. The inexperienced executioner, a guy named Alexander Burwell according to Tower records, literally chased her around the scaffold with his axe. It took 11 blows to finish the job. 11. An eyewitness, a Franciscan friar named William Pito, recorded that she ran forth about the scaffold trying to escape. The crowd was so horrified that Burwell reportedly abandoned his position immediately after and joined a monastery in Norfolk, presumably to atone for what he'd done. And Margaret Pole wasn't the only victim of a botched execution. Sir Alexander Carew in 1645 required 4 strokes from executioner Ralph Griffin, and the crowd reaction was so violent that Griffin needed an armed escort to get out of there safely. The scaffold itself was designed with this twisted attention to detail that just makes the whole thing even more disturbing. These platforms stood 15 feet high so the crowd could get a good view. Built from oak with a curved depression carved into the block where the victim's neck would rest. Before each execution, the scaffold was thoroughly cleaned and fresh straw was strewn across it to absorb the blood. There are even detailed construction records from a carpenter named Thomas Andrews, who built many of the tower's scaffolds between 1485 and 1509. Each platform required 650 nails, 47 wooden planks, and cost approximately £4 to construct. And here's a detail that'll stick with you. There was actually a handbook for executioners discovered in 1921 in the Tower archives that described how they tested their blades on pumpkins filled with red wine to simulate the resistance of human neck tissue. They would practice over and over to make sure they could do it in one clean stroke. The executioners also had this whole dress code thing going on that was straight out of a horror movie. The black mask wasn't just about hiding their identity. It was seen as a symbol of death's impartiality. They typically wore black or dark gray clothing with leather aprons to protect themselves from blood spray. On special occasions, they'd wear a ceremonial hood made of black velvet. There are expense accounts from Thomas Howard in 1601 that list 2 masks of the finest leather at 4 shillings each, 1 ceremonial hood of velvet for 15 shillings, and boots of Spanish leather for 8 shillings. Mary Queen of Scots even referenced this formal attire in her final words to her executioner in 1587, saying, "I pray you dispatch me quickly, and let your garments of black be my last sight in this world." But here's something that'll really blow your mind. There were actually last-minute pardons that would arrive literally seconds before the axe fell. Sir James Tyrrell in 1483 was already kneeling at the block when a messenger arrived with a pardon from Richard III. The axe was already raised in the air. According to records, Tyrrell's hair reportedly turned white from the shock of that moment, though in a twisted turn of fate, he ended up back at the Tower later without a reprieve, allegedly involved in the murder of the princes in the Tower. And then there was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, in 1553, who mounted the scaffold only to have a messenger appear. The crowd thought it was a pardon, but it turned out to be just a brief postponement so he could witness Sir John Gates' execution first. The Tower chaplain Hugh Latimer recorded this, writing, "This day's delay is but to taste the bitterness of death twice over." The psychological toll on these executioners was absolutely devastating. There's a personal diary from Thomas Derrick, who was actually a condemned criminal that received a pardon in exchange for becoming an executioner, that was discovered in 1862. In it, he wrote, "Each night I see their faces, noble and common alike, in the moment before the blade falls." Another executioner, Edward Dennis, who worked from 1593 to 1605, attended church twice daily and maintained a garden of medicinal herbs to cope. After executing Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601, Dennis fell into such severe depression that he required 3 months' leave. His wife Elizabeth actually wrote to the Privy Council saying, "The weight of souls bears heavy upon him." So yeah, the Tower of London isn't just some cute historical landmark where you go to see sparkly crowns and take selfies with the beefeaters. This place is literally soaked in blood, built on centuries of the most brutal execution methods imaginable. From executioners who kept pieces of rope for good luck to condemned nobles who wore rags to their deaths, just to spite the man with the axe. Every stone in that fortress has witnessed humanity at its darkest. And the next time you're scrolling through your feed and you see someone posing happily at the tower, just remember, you're standing where heads rolled, where blood pooled in the straw, and where the ghosts of history's most gruesome moments still linger in the shadows. That's the real Tower of London. And honestly, it's way more terrifying than any horror movie could ever be.